Well, it's wonderful to have some familiar faces on the line today, and some new faces as well. And so, what I wanted to do today is just kind of talk about some of the tensions. I know that you did some thinking beforehand, and thank you for all of those really riveting questions and ideas. I think we're going to touch on two things. We're going to go kind of deep on different ways to kind of measure and think about learning in makerspaces, and we're also going to do a little bit of kind of thinking about pedagogy, and you'll get a deeper dive into that in the next call with Ed Clapp as well. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. So for me, I'm really interested in this idea of, how do we get kids involved in something like making, something really rich and sort of project-based, and not interrupt the flow of that activity, but really start to understand it from our perspective, to speak to funders, to think to parents, to other administrators, to, state policymakers, and how do we start to make a compelling body of evidence? So I'm going to share some of the lessons learned along that way. So all of you have been tracking sort of the larger maker movement and, the excitement around it in spaces like this. And I think that there's kind of two tensions in this work, is that, you have folks like Dale Doherty, the father of this maker movement, really kind of talking about how the maker movement, part of what we are all excited about it is this idea that you can learn almost anything by making. And at the other flip side is that we have these national sort of policy. We are rooted in our own historical moment, and a lot of the national attention is sort of paid to sort of the STEM competencies, the science and engineering, the science festivals, the robotics competitions and fairs. So how do we start to think about these tensions of all of the non-cognitive measures, the creativity and the engagement, the other kinds of things that we care about, as well as the disciplinary types of engagement that are tied to a lot of our funding cycles and so forth. That's reified in all of these different ways they're making. And so, I can imagine your maker spaces and, are riddled with things like these paper roller coasters that kind of cover physics and paper kind of making, all sorts of things that could be learned. Other types of things like 3D printers and sort of toy hacking that this group up in Toronto does with kids, could have all of these, you might even think about them as literacy measures of kind of what does it mean to take these toys and text and sort of, rearrange. You see the little Barbie doll here with this bear head, for example. What does it mean to actually be able to create those kinds of things and to create your own games, for example? You can look at this one, this slide here, for those that you can see it, is this little Arduino kind of controller kind of hooked up to these couple of Post-it notes, and you kind of have to ask yourself, well, what's happening here? And, for those of you that aren't on mute, you may want to go ahead and mute for everyone. But these little Post-it notes are actually a handmade speaker. So that you can actually project the sound in real time. So what does it mean to create the everyday objects that are around you and to engage in some of the computer science and engineering that's involved in doing this? And then all of the traditional kinds of robotics pieces, from the hoverboards to the robots to the little art bots and scribble bots that are really popular in these spaces. So we've got a challenge. We have to kind of think about how to create these spaces. We've got to think about the learning that happens in these spaces. And so what we've been doing kind of together with the Maker Ed initiative and through help with the Moore Foundation, we've been visiting many of you, actually. We've gone to library spaces and different at-home spaces and schools to kind of see how making is playing out. And across this work, we've started to sort of derive some of these principles. So this is a small piece we've just written up that I'd be happy to share. But how do we start to design spaces? Because our pedagogy no longer is just how we act in the classroom. We're starting to understand that the materials that we have, how the space is constructed, how do we start to think about this as the maker spaces? So we took a lot of these principles that were, at play in what we had seen of sort of the best of makerspaces. We had toured maybe 20 or 30 makerspaces across the US and internationally. And we started thinking about some principles like visibility. So you can see, these are some of the before pictures. These were 2 rooms, it was kind of crowded with furniture and nobody was really using it. And we had kind of torn down this outer wall here. This is the university's makerspace at Indiana University. And we tore out this outer wall and just put in a whole wall of glass so you could see what was happening there. Created kind of an open space that could be remixed with furniture. We hung electrical cords that would come from the ceiling. You can see that this is kind of mid-process. We took out all of the traditional flooring and just kind of kept the cement there that was in place. So we thought about this idea of visibility, of transparency, of mobility, and diversity as we started to create these spaces. And this is actually what the university space now looks like. And it's been really fun to kind of think about, at the higher ed level, how can we start to train teachers and start to think about this? How can we give them access to the tools and materials, that you might have that, already available in your spaces? Right now, we are one of 2 higher education spaces that actually has a makerspace in it. Most of these spaces are being dominated by schools of engineering, computer science, and so forth. And so we have to kind of think about this whole pipeline as how do we prepare educators to come into the spaces that you're already creating? How can they know how to use these technologies in a transformative way, and so forth? So it's been exciting to kind of share some of that, here. I'll just play a couple seconds of this video here. Just take you inside the middle. There because so many of you are on the phone, but what you see in this kind of short video and what has transformed over time is how we're starting to get so many different educators involved, coming from an arts ed perspective or a science ed perspective. We're getting people that are interested in foreign language learning, even counseling and ed psych faculty involved in kind of thinking about this. So, a lot of what I'm going to be sharing today is sort of what we're learning and how we can start to move this forward. One of the things that we've been learning about the pedagogy of this space, and I venture to say that many of you have been learning the same, is that the people that are running these kinds of spaces, is that it's not so important that they are experts in the field, right? It's about that they have an interest in learning how to learn, that they model that they have an excitement around tackling something new. So when a faculty member from science ed comes in and has never used the 3D printer, or an undergraduate, that they say, oh, that's interesting. Let's see if we can try that. And if they come up with an idea that hasn't been explored before, how can we start to tackle that? And a lot of times that's failure and kind of going through it, but really working at the edge of it. And soon what you find is that everyone is kind of garnering expertise over time, and that people start to teach each other. So we're starting to create a community of people. So there's not just one expert or kind of one person that knows all of this, but that there's an array of folks that can kind of start to help out. This notion of tinkering is one that I want to share with you today. Tinkering is characterized by a playful, experimental, iterative style of engagement in which makers are continually reassessing their goals, exploring new paths, and imagining new possibilities. This definition comes from Resnick and Rosenbaum, and in a 2014 piece that they had done. And I think that this is, oftentimes we kind of get into an engineering mindset of kind of a first, second, third, fourth, a process that's already there. But tinkering is much more ground up. We don't know what the end results are. And you can imagine, though we might kind of laud this kind of pedagogy, it can become even more difficult if the kids are taking a lesson in 20 different directions. How do we start to assess that? As opposed to some of the ways in which we thought of traditionally about hands-on education as we move forward. So this is one of our challenges as we move ahead. As you think about designing for this kind of tinkerability that allows for this kind of rich learning to happen here, Resnick and Rosenbaum kind of have three different areas that they encourage, sort of, doing things that have immediate feedback. For those of you that have used LEDs, for example, when that light doesn't turn on, you didn't get it right yet. And then there's this sort of reward, this very base reward about kind of getting it to turn on and getting it to successfully happen. So choosing materials and choosing activities that kind of have that and, ingrained in it. The second part is the fluid experimentation, is, kind of allowing something not to work and then something to kind of engage from that. I had seen somebody had a wind tunnel that was set up, and there was just kind of paper there, and you were just kind of trying to catch the wind to see if you could make it hover above the machine. So there was paper and paper cups and different ways of putting that there. But there was kind of no right. It was just, if the paper was constructed in this way, it would kind of catch hold. If it was caught in this way, it would catch hold. And, the different solutions became really interesting to kind of talk about what was happening in that space. And that the third principle is really around open exploration. They've got a really, really nice chapter that kind of has a variety of ideas for educators. I'm not going to go through all of these for those of you that can see the slide, but there's really kind of good mindsets. It's a nice chapter, I think, to kind of, for the person leading your makerspace to kind of think about, encouraging process over product, for example. It's not the end result, but it's the process that you engage in. This is kind of a life, lesson for arts educators. And so your arts education faculty are probably already deeply rooted in this. Doing themes and not challenges. So you can think about, when you're makerspace, you can think about the, kind of building a bridge or the tallest tower is kind of a challenge where there's kind of like one way to optimize this work. But think about themes instead of a traditional Little Bits exercise. Think about doing kind of a theme park where everybody's doing a ride and you've got an exhibition at the end. So it stresses diversity in those solutions and so forth. There's a few other principles that they suggest as you're designing your makerspace: to tinker with the space itself, to engage with the people and not just the materials. So, a lot of setting up these makerspaces can be about what to purchase and when, but to really think about the guiding pedagogy. And I saw that in so many of the questions that you had thought about coming into this meeting today. And a variety of others. I could share a copy of this chapter with all of you to share with your site leaders as well. So in terms of the pedagogy, kind of emphasizing, in summary, kind of thinking about tinkering as kind of the core of your pedagogy, kind of help to preserve this kind of wonderful and robust space, this makerspace that you have going on. But there's also different ways to kind of get people involved. The hint I gave before about kind of having somebody, right now we have an undergrad running our makerspace. And really the best thing about that undergrad is that they say, I don't know, and they try to learn something, from that. And that's, partially because we don't have money to afford a full-time hire, but it's also partially about, what is going to absolutely make this space a success at the university level. And it's really about modeling that. Our colleagues over in the library, had simultaneously kind of launched a space on campus where they had 20 3D printers that were installed, and they had a bunch of other equipment kind of donated as well. And they opened it like a printing service. And it wasn't until they came over to see that this was modeled that they started to understand how to create a true makerspace. And they went back and sort of revised the library programs and how they staffed them, and are still in that process. process, but really visiting existing makerspaces, kind of seeing how that's in action, because a lot of our tendencies don't necessarily always translate to productive principles and pedagogies in the makerspace. There's a few different workshops if you're thinking about sending your educators. MakerEd is actually set up as a nonprofit, a national nonprofit, to provide this type of support to your educators. And they have an upcoming in November, they've got an upcoming workshop around some of these assessment and portfolio making kind of things. So if you're interested in that, there'll be more of those workshops later, but that'll be happening in Pittsburgh. So I know several of you are calling in from Pittsburgh, but it'd be a good chance to send people there. There's also, the work that Project Zero's doing that you'll hear more about next week. And then there's other types of hands-on training that are kind of happening throughout the network. So I'll share some of those immediate leads with the folks at Digital Promise to circulate to you later today. But those are, you want to kind of look out for some of those. So the second part we're going to tackle today is not just thinking about the pedagogies, and we can talk further about that, but we'll also be talking a little bit about how to think about learning within this context. So one of the groups that I've been looking really deeply at is e-textiles. And so electronic textiles that are little wearable computers that can be embedded in clothing and, can start to have all these fashion implications, from Lady Gaga's costume that kind of collapses into the work, or, kind of a GPS kind of display, so that it's displayed on your jacket for the seeing impaired, so you know whether to turn right or left. At a particular street corner. There's healthcare applications and sports applications of e-textiles and so forth. And so we've been kind of thinking about sort of where is the STEM learning within these e-textiles. And so for those of you that can see the image here, this is kind of a close-up of what those tools and materials look like. So it's a little lily pad Arduino, and the girl is kind of creating a shirt and kind of sewing down to that first LED there, and kind of rerouting the circuit back there. So in projects like that, you can see we start to understand sort of what's the possible disciplinary kinds of connections to this work, right? And so many of you have probably already started thinking about this. So in a traditional robotics application, for example, you learn about coding and computer programming, and you also learn about circuitry or electronic construction. And both of those kind of have different disciplinary roots, some of them more in engineering, some of them more in computer science. As we move over into the LilyPad Arduino, we see that there's that same circuitry and coding pieces there, but we also have to learn how to craft, and there's a greater emphasis in e-textiles on the craft of that construction. For those of you that have done robotics, oftentimes you can get all these messy wires and you kind of stuff it in a plastic box and you kind of forget about it. And e-textiles, you're forced to really think about the quality of that craftsmanship, the ways in which you've designed that, because you have all these exposed wires in the process, and you have to think through not only how to make them beautiful, but how to make them that circuitry, the construction, strong. So one of the things we've been looking at is just kind of focusing on one of those nexus. So if you think about the circuitry practices, the coding practices, and the crafting practices in e-textiles, we've been kind of diving into this. What is circuitry? And one of the things that we've started to understand is that in traditional kinds of circuitry, we demonstrate this understanding time and time again through circuitry diagrams. And so for those of you that can see the slide, you'll see the pre-test results of a child that kind of came out of our workshops, or came into our workshops that had just studied this in schools, right? And by asking him to display this and transfer that understanding of what he had learned into schools into this new circuitry diagram, he had drawn something that wouldn't work whatsoever. It looks like a big spider web that would have shorted the circuit right away. He was convinced it was right. He was convinced that he understood the domain. And you can see after our workshops, we had that sorted out on the post-test results. It's a very simple circuit with the battery drawn well and the circuit diagram to the LED and the switch. And so you could see this kind of learning time and time again. But as we were designing these assessments, we had to kind of think about a material switch, is that not asking the kids to demonstrate their understanding of the traditional materials, but also ways in which to demonstrate that understanding. So I know some of you have gotten already pretty creative about this, whether it's you're thinking about Scratch and looking at understanding computer science principles and how you've demonstrated that over time. But thinking about assessments like this, how do you normally test this, and how might you test this in a new makerspace? And I'm happy to share this particular assessment with you as well. And it wasn't just this particular child, it was everybody in the workshop had learned this significantly. This is the same kind of thing, when you go into college freshmen that already want to major in physics or engineering, they still don't understand the basics of circuitry at the college level. This has been true since the 1960s. And so this has been really a problem of practice for a long period of time. Many of you on the phone are probably saying, yeah, I remember experiencing circuits at one point, but I don't remember exactly the big ideas behind them. And this is true the way we think about this. So we were kind of compelled to start to compare these new makerspace toolkits like e-textiles and little bits and snap circuits and squishy circuits to the traditional ones we've had in schools, and see how they fared. My hope was just that they would do equally as well as the tools and materials we have traditionally used in schools. And so to test this, we had done something where we had, taken about 50 kids in each group and but it was probably about 250 kids total, and randomly assigned them to one of 5 groups where they got one of these kits and these assessments. And then we gave them a pre-test before they got started, and then gave them a 90-minute kind of intervention and kind of first exposure to those tools and materials, and then we post-tested them again. And so they didn't get exposed; they only got exposure to 1 out of those 5 toolkits. And what was interesting and what we hadn't expected is that when we started comparing the kits, they really did differently, even though we covered the same content and the same length of time, depending on which of the kits that you had engaged in. And for me, this ties a lot to the digital promise legacy as well, and sort of how do we start to think about the quality of the tools and materials that we're starting to use in our spaces. And I think the maker spaces really kind of give us some diversity in that work. And so what you're seeing here in the graph is that the e-textiles ended up significantly outperforming the other groups. But what was really shameful really is that our Hand to Mind group, the group that was getting the typical toolkit in schools, they actually showed no gains whatsoever over that period of time. And some of the constructs actually got worse at. They also weren't able to transfer that understanding to the assessments and the other pieces. And so it gets us to kind of think, how much are we questioning the utility of our tool sets? How much are we able to really think about how they shape and redefine learning, across these. And I'm happy to chat further about this. And these are, the t-tests. And so you can see, the kids doing, significantly better in all 4 of the groups, from the traditional maker kits, and no significant differences from the traditional school kit, which is really fascinating. So it's not just about circuitry and it's not just about coding. We've been looking at math and looking at fashion design, for example, in some of the LUSD schools, and what's been happening there. So one of the interesting things is that we've been interviewing, fashion designers and sewers and seamstresses, and what are they learning? And they keep telling us about 2D to 3D mental rotation. For those of you that are kind of new to that, we don't stress it often in schools, but it's correlated. If you do well on these early exams, oftentimes you're put into gifted education tracks. You're also, life outcomes are predicted well. These are also the kinds of tests, and actually we use the exact same test that it would take to get into the Purdue School of Engineering, which is one of the top schools of engineering in the country. You have to do well on this mental rotation, and it's correlated well with doing well in general in engineering schools. So you can see what some of these items sort of look like here and how that maps on to, the fashion design process. What was interesting is we've been following this group that does a fashion design kind of elective in LAUSD, and we did a pre-test and a post-test over a period of a year. And we also kind of compared not only just the fashion design, but to computer science, to games, and to the control group. And we use this Purdue spatial visualization task for mental rotation. And what you can see is that the women in fashion outperformed the women in all of the other settings. But you can also see that their gain scores look like their male peers. And this is related to, typically males tend to do better on this task than their female peers. There's a lot of bias in this. So we're seeing fashion is really contributing to this spatial rotation quite a bit. We also, the same group and the same 4 conditions, the fashion, computer science, games, and control groups, we also looked at sort of their attitudes towards math, their math anxiety. So you can see, these better scores here on this graph. The fashion significantly outperforms all of the other groups in terms of their math anxiety. The control group actually gets more anxious about math, not having any of these other kinds of interventions around math. But fashion actually has less anxiety over time dealing with math, because they're seeing math every day, the measurement, the ratio, the proportion, all of the things that we know to be difficult in math for these age groups as being important here. We can also see in the same measures these effective motivation scores, so that the higher scores indicate more effective motivation towards math. And you see small gains across all of the games, the computer science and fashion, but really large gains on fashion, and again, a decline in the control groups there. So these kinds of measures, we'll talk more about them in a moment, but these kinds of measures, we used math, but you can measure science, you can measure any type of discipline that you're interested in seeing how their attitude towards these domains really differs over time. And these are very classic instruments used in evaluation work. A couple more examples, from the Scratch world, looking at computer science and arts learning. For those of you that don't know Scratch, it's a media-rich visual programming language that's available on the web that has millions of users worldwide at this point, and close to 20 million projects posted by youth, that cover a whole range of things. But the impetus behind Scratch was really to introduce computer programming to youth in a way that allowed them to kind of take on the medium of the computer and control the media of their lives, so that it's a 2D visual programming language, so I can import all my favorite characters and I can remix them. The kids that I work with start to say that computer programming starts to feel like paper. They can make it into whatever they want it to make into. So these kinds of tools become important for rethinking the domains, something like computer science, where we've had trouble traditionally getting people involved. If you're looking at this slide, you can kind of see, here's just a traditional stack of commands, and you can see all of these interesting computational concepts that are happening. This is just from a game like Pong that one of the kids had made, the traditional paddle game, where the ball touching the paddle will make it bounce, and you try to keep that going as long as you can. But you can see things like loops and variables, conditionals, statements, and random numbers all employed here. Things that are really challenging even for computer science majors at the undergraduate level. And this is just in a free choice studio in Los Angeles. We had followed the computational concepts in learning in Scratch. And you can see, the kinds of concepts they engaged in year 1 to year 2. And most of these actually significantly increased in year 2. So you can imagine something like variables that kids, have challenging learning in class. All of a sudden within this context, they want to learn how to do a variable because they want to keep track of the score in the game. So you can see as more kids understood that that's what it was for, the more they wanted to use it and learn about it. And things like Scratch is not just about all of our STEM outcomes, as we had talked about, is we want to think about the whole of the child, and these arts outcomes being equally as important. So we've looked at those within Scratch as well. it wasn't as easy in terms of doing this, but we took the portfolio to like a group of media artists, and we had, they created a scoring rubric that had 5 dimensions around originality, criticality, technique and skill, the use of medium, and the overall ideas, and had scored that across the archive of the work that had been created over 2 years. And again, you see these significant increases. So I think once you know what you're looking for and you create an engaging community, you're going to find what it is that you think the kids are going to be learning. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to document that. For those of you that are interested, we do have a curriculum series out called Interconnections that kind of spans some of this approach, putting design thinking at the core for game design with GameStar Mechanic, e-fashion with e-textiles, e-puppets, and digital storytelling with Scratch. So this kind of gets at a lot of the next generation science standards, the Common Core language arts standards, and kind of provides different kinds of assessments throughout the way. All right, so thank you. I'm going to pause here so we can have a more rich discussion, but that's a brief introduction to the kind of research that's been happening in the lab and the ways in which we've been thinking about documenting learning and through making.
Great. Thank you so much, Kylie. So now we'll let folks jump in with their questions.
Okay, I'll break the silence. This is Todd Karushkin.
Right.
Kylie, thank you so much, and great to see you again. Question for you: is there that rubric that you talked about the artist put together? Is that something you could share with us? I think we're all, people that are starting to have the maker movements happening in their schools. I think we struggle with documenting what the kids are learning, what are they gaining. What STEM skills are they gaining? Are they gaining career kind of ideas with the STEM field? We're just struggling with that. And, I don't want to survey the kids to death and pre and post survey, but we do want to start to gather data. I mean, we're happy with them making things. And I love your picture of, the kids drawing a circuit before and then after. And that's real practical and you can see. But I just think that any other things you could share with us regarding rubrics or anything you could share would be greatly appreciated.
Right. So I think folks want to give me sort of a list of follow-up because I think you're going to want these more in handout form. But I'll just briefly survey that. So this is a group of media artists that these are professional media artists that had kind of come up with these rubrics. There's others that exist in the field of arts ed, but they simply came down to 5 big ideas around the originality of the idea. So this is something that's not in practice elsewhere. So for example, one of the kids had tried to recreate a video game. Well, that wasn't highly original. Whereas one of the girls had kind of created a birthday card and had kind of then done her own way of doing music, her own way of singing happy birthday. So that scored really high on originality. Criticality, kind of the way in which the youth were engaging in that, and kind of like not just replicating what it is that they've seen, but disengaging that. So I think the Happy Birthday song is a really good one in recent years. Disney has kind of claimed rights to Happy Birthday. So kind of just critically engaging it and kind of remixing that, of course, is being important. The use of medium and the approach, so if you use a computer programming language similar to kind of telling a story, and there's no interactivity, that would be kind of not a great use of that medium. You might want to use some other tool for it. Whereas a video game or some sort of interactivity would have a better use of that medium and approach. The technique and the skill, kind of having higher level kind of commands would be a good one there, and other kinds of things that would be the technique. But it could also be around the image making. Did they just cut and paste an image, or did they resize it? Did they recolor it to kind of create something that was a coherent project? And what's the overall success of that? So again, these are more about the creative and artistic development of the youth, but this is a nice rubric to use. And so I have it here for folks, but I'm making a note to circulate that one as well.
Kylie, this is Pam Moran. I'm with Chad Ratliff here in Albemarle, and a couple of things that are on our mind. One is that I'm really interested in the metacognitive processing when you talk about the girls or anybody, boys or girls, involved in sewing and how that changes attitudes potentially towards math. One of the things that I'm really interested in is in the process, how does their metacognition get shifted as a result of engaging in something that involves using math so purposefully as they are creating or making, whether it's in sewing materials or anything else that they're doing with that. So that's something that's on my mind, is what does making do to metacognition that could be different than what you see in more traditional learning environments. And then the other thing that's on my mind is when kids are engaged in multiples of, maybe they're in a makerspace where they are doing different things. Sometimes they're sewing, sometimes they're coding, sometimes they're building things from scratch, like the toy, the sort of the hacked toys piece. Is there something that amplifies capabilities, competencies, when kids move across multiple versions of different ways of approaching making versus being stuck almost? It's almost like that making becomes, if you're in a makerspace, it becomes a more multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, or transdisciplinary space as compared to a singular discipline space, and what makes that different in terms of kids perhaps accelerating competency development. So those are a couple things that are on my mind, and I sure hope we'll be able to get a copy of your slides, because there's some really good data I'd love to be able to revisit with Chad.
Absolutely. I'm more than happy to share. So the first part about metacognitive processing, I think that this is true. Part of what we're starting to see, again and again is sort of in the making, there's sort of an agency that happens there where you start to take responsibility for your learning. And part of that is that reflection on the learning process. So I just want to compare for a moment what you see in sort of what we call math craft versus school craft. So on school craft, right, who's most often judging your paper to say whether it's right or wrong, right? Maybe you catch a few of those, but oftentimes that comes from the expert in the room, often the teacher, maybe a more kind of gifted peer on those exercises, that sort of disenfranchises you from that. Oftentimes there's a sense of there's only one way to go about this math problem, that we're all learning the same way. When we go into kind of craft math by counter, is that we start to see, so you're starting to use these algorithms to knit, for example, and you do something wrong, you apply the coding, the code's wrong, and the knitting, you can actually see it. And the knitter is just so compelled to actually fix it themselves. So they've got a way of visualizing it, of concretizing the mistake, and they also are motivated to then kind of correct those mistakes over time and to engage in that. So I think part of the metacognitive piece is kind of paying attention to the mistake making, and so the rupturing of that. You could imagine small tasks of, how would you go about organizing this activity, things where they're reflecting on that, and how could they have streamlined that process more so. So you can imagine some really nice ways of collecting that data. So I think that that's an excellent focus. I don't know that there's a lot of research that has been happening on there, but I'll keep an eye out for that. But I think that's a wonderful thing that captures a lot of what's happening in makerspaces. The second part around the disciplines and the interdisciplinary thing, and this is like it's been a riddle for me my entire career, is that on the surface we like this idea of STEAM, and we like this idea of trans disciplines or interdisciplinary kind of work. But then at the end of the day, it doesn't, unless we can kind of talk about as disciplinary foundations, there's something really challenging to get people to recognize the learning that's happening there. And so this is, kind of where I've ended up in this struggle, and hopefully, you can find some other inroads to handle problems separately. But I have found that, when you're talking to funders and you're talking to folks, is that they really want a core disciplinary piece. It's the kind of thing where we have inherited sort of our understanding of learning, from the Greco-Roman times, and the way that's kind of been instantiated on college campuses, for example. The departments are there. It's just really deeply rooted in our culture. And I'd like to say that we could understand an interdisciplinary argument, but for the most part, you kind of have to say arts and sciences, right? Like, you have to look at the learning that's happening in arts and the sciences and show those learning outcomes that are there. It makes it a lot harder on our assessment pieces, but I think equally paying attention to it does have a benefit, is that sometimes when we overly focus on just the STEM outcomes, we fail to see the arts outcomes. We saw this time and again in our Scratch work. The kids that were really great on STEM, that had this like long coding, like 20 pages of code, actually were the least sophisticated in their artwork. And the kids that had a very simple amount of code had the most profound artwork that the professional artists were comparing to other professional kinds of works. And so when we just attune ourselves to one of those disciplines, we don't see the things that are missing from the others.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so I've got a list. I've got the slides. I've got the arts rubric. I'm imagining some of you might want those the anxiety and motivation scales as well. But let me know what else.
I think you mentioned a copy of the chapter that talks about, I can't remember exactly what it is anymore, but
great. Yeah, the tinkering chapter. Yeah.
Yep, the book chapter and the design principles.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, and we just came out with the 2 Makeology books. And for those of you that are on the screen, let me just share a couple other things with you. And so let me see. This is the, oh, that's not the one, I'm sorry. Apologies. If I don't launch this, then it won't come up. Okay. All right. So this is, for those of you that can see my screen, this one. Okay, there we go. All right, so this is the MakerEd Open Portfolio Workshop, where we are diving into kind of how to document learning and how to assess that. And so this is a hands-on workshop with the folks in Pittsburgh, hosted by MakerEd and supported by the Moore Foundation. So that's that piece. The Makeology books, I'm happy to send free copies if you just get me an address and a shipping address. I'll get those in the mail to you guys this week. But these are 2 volumes that we put together to kind of start to become the status of the field. So the first volume is really on makerspaces as learning environments and some of the learnings that happen in creating those environments. And the second is around makers as learners and kind of really thinking about some of the disciplinary pieces there. So you can this will give you a sense of the status of the field and where people are at, kind of introduce you to, maybe a few other people that are doing some of the research. With different backgrounds as well. So feel free to send a copy of a mailing address, and we'll get those out to you this week. And the tinkering chapter is already online, so I'll just send a link to that.
Excellent, thank you. Other questions? Kylie, I'll just ask one question for the group. I think, one of the things the group has been really interested in is, how do you assess learning? And you showed a few assessments, but for doing this, obviously this is a different kind of learning that's taking place that requires kinds of new, non-traditional kinds of assessments. What is your advice or thoughts for schools who want to, if they have something specific they want to measure and maybe finding assessments that are already out there or connecting with researchers to help them sort of understand those changes?
Yeah, and a part of how we hope to address this is through this phase 2 of the open portfolio work, is that we're putting together a list of those assessments and different ways of thinking through doing that. General advice that I have is thinking about your portfolio practices and just documenting that work. And so kind of putting it together and thinking about how to compile all of that so that you've got this work that you could send out to be assessed through an evaluator. Thinking about, kind of really tiptoeing into this, thinking about putting together like an evaluation battery. What we hope to kind of do as part of the open portfolio work is to do like an assessment clearinghouse. So you wouldn't have to kind of go through me or somebody else, but there'd be kind of one hub of assessments that you could use to kind of assess different kinds of outcomes and share those outcomes with others as well. So I think a traditional evaluation firm is kind of the way to go if you want to do some larger scale assessment, that they will help to kind of score up those pieces. Those are different than, say, research projects. Research projects are kind of about, kind of charting into unknown territory. So the metacognition pieces, for example, you can imagine the first time or two that you're trying to understand metacognition and makerspaces is kind of the research. The scaling of that and kind of turning that into an evaluation paradigm and something that you can use in multiple settings is kind of the evaluative kind of portions, so that through the research there's sort of measurement and those creations there. So I'd say most faculty would be interested in sharing that work. There is a need, with Digital Promise here too, there's kind of a need to kind of start to consolidate these pieces together to start to be that central place that you can start to document that work, because it is really scattered. So part of your confusion is one that's part of the field, and it's not just in makerspaces. This is a problem that we have, across. When you talk about design thinking, you talk about makerspaces. Almost anything that you're looking to evaluate the arts or STEM learning, this becomes challenging and getting access to the tools and materials to do that. But I think this is a place where we can sort of start to collaborate together to create that. What I would call an assessment clearinghouse.
Yeah, I think many on this call would be very excited about that being created.
And from there, right, it's not just having access to them, it's really kind of getting to know your programs, right? And so, and really kind of thinking, a lot of times I would start with just kind of interviewing the educator of like, what are the core outcomes that you think are not being captured here? And oftentimes, they have really good ideas of what that is, or talking to the students about what do you think you were learning in the process, so you can start to hone that. Oftentimes the mistake, once we have those assessment clearinghouses, is how to map those on to what's happening on the ground. And we tend to pick instruments that we would like to see what's happening, but it's not necessarily mapped to what is happening. So do plan like a small period, like a trial period where you're using these assessments in small batches to kind of inform that, looking to see if there's any growth over time in doing so. Know that, you can go with an outside firm. It's probably cheaper to kind of have somebody in-house doing that work, but know that it is a significant amount of time. Oftentimes I work with nonprofits and they've got all this data, but they don't have anybody to analyze it, right? And that's also an area where you could partner with somebody to help you analyze that work. But really, having somebody look over your tools and then help you to kind of formulate that over time. Once you have a clear process, it's not so hard.
All right. Any last question for Kylie? Okay, well, thank you so much, Kylie, for that, and thanks everybody for joining. I hope that you found this valuable. We'll follow up with a survey just to gather your thoughts on what was most valuable, and we'll also follow up with all of the different resources and tools that Kylie had mentioned, as well as her slides.